ID, now. May I ask what this is about, officer? Don't play smart. You're loitering. People like you don't just sit in places like this. I'm not causing harm, just sitting. Yeah? Well, you don't look like you belong. Here, move it, or I'll make it official. This park's been mine longer than your badge. Early in the morning, as the city of Charlotte was just beginning to stir, an elderly man stepped through the courthouse doors. The light was still soft, the streets damp from the night air, but inside, the building was already humming with routine. He moved with deliberate calm, shoulders straight though his back protested the effort. His shoes, worn but polished, made a slow rhythm against the marble floor. In one hand he held a plain, dark hat, removed at the entrance and now cradled like a memory. His shirt was pressed, his jacket old but clean, his trousers modest. He avoided no one's eyes, yet looked. At no one directly. He walked not with defiance, but with quiet purpose. George Peterson, 82 years old, veteran of Afghanistan, came not seeking justice, but because he had been summoned. 2 days earlier, he had been sitting alone on a bench in Harmony Green Park, a narrow strip of green space near the city's aging municipal hall. It was not a place of grandeur, but one that held meaning. He had watched saplings sway gently in the wind, the same trees he remembered as bare dirt and chalk lines when he returned from overseas service decades ago. He sat in stillness, observing more than watching, letting time move around him. That was when Officer Craig Donnelly pulled his cruiser into the adjacent lot. Young, upright, always alert, Donnelly believed in decisive action. Suspicion for him needed no clear trigger, only instinct. An old man alone, unmoving, in a city known for its uneven tensions, seemed out of place to him. He approached quickly, asked for identification, then asked again. George didn't argue, but didn't rush either. Donnelly closed the distance. When Peterson did not rise immediately, he was taken in. There was no formal arrest, no Miranda rights. Donnelly marked it down as detained for clarification. In the station, a report was drafted, citing suspicious loitering and noncompliance with verbal directives. The language was vague, but the paperwork was filed, and the system, unbothered, moved forward. Now, George Peterson sat alone at the defendant's table. No lawyer beside him, no family in the rows behind. The clerk shuffled papers. The judge scanned her docket. It was a low-priority case, one of many that day. A simple matter. An elderly man who had been slow to move. A familiar script. Craig Donnelly stood by with his usual poise. His badge gleamed under the ceiling lights. His stance was firm, confident, a man convinced he had done nothing wrong. The routine was intact. He had written it up, followed the code, filed the motion. In his mind, the matter was already closed, but someone else was already making their way toward the courthouse. Someone who had not forgotten the name George Peterson, nor the lessons once learned under his quiet, exacting command. The judge read the case materials with a clinical detachment, her pen tapping softly against the edge of the file. The charges, listed in careful legal phrasing, offered little weight. Passive resistance, failure to vacate a public space. There were no allegations of aggression, no reports of threats or disorderly conduct. No body cam footage had been submitted. No third-party witnesses were identified. The entire foundation of the case rested on Officer Donnelly's written account and his personal assessment. The courtroom remained subdued. A few administrative staff moved quietly along the edges. The clerk entered additional notes into the system, and the ceiling lights buzzed faintly overhead. Donnelly stood with arms crossed, expression tight, watching the proceedings as if bracing against a storm he didn't believe would arrive. In his mind, everything was by the book. When the judge asked if the defendant wished to speak, George Peterson rose slowly, using no cane, no aid. His stature had thinned with time, but the way he stood gave no impression of weakness. He didn't glance at the crowd, didn't search for sympathy. Instead, he spoke in an even tone, focused not on defense, but on recollection. He described the park, Harmony Green, not as a location, but as a chapter of his own return from war. He spoke of how years ago he had helped clear the lot where that park now sat. How he worked with city volunteers to lay gravel pathways, to plant the first trees, to turn it into something that could bring quiet to a growing city. He told it plainly, without embellishment, as if reporting on weather or road work. It was not an appeal, it was context. He had not wandered into that space by accident. He had returned to something he had helped build. The courtroom fell quiet. There was no reaction, only that subtle shift in posture that meant people were listening harder now. The judge said nothing for a long moment. Then she closed the file softly and requested more time to verify the defendant's background. The defense motioned to delay proceedings for a day, to confirm military service records and additional documentation. The motion was accepted without objection. The next morning, just after 10, a tall man in a dark service uniform entered the courthouse. He moved without spectacle, but not without notice. His shoulders bore the insignia of a general, and his expression held a weight that years in command often carved into a person. He was not there to disrupt. He was there to witness. General James Ellerby took a seat in the gallery before being acknowledged. 2 decades earlier, he had been a cadet under George Peterson's instruction. It was in dusty fields and night drills where he had learned about pressure, restraint, and how leadership was not about force, but about steadiness when others wavered. He had carried those lessons through 2 wars, 3 continents, and the burden of decisions that could not be undone. When called forward, he handed a letter to the court. It was brief. No formal language, no emotional flourish, just 3 paragraphs. In it, he described George Peterson not by rank or award, but by principle. He wrote that Peterson's life had been an act of service not bound by orders or medals, but by quiet example, that his influence was not measured in salutes, but in the silence of those who had learned from him how to hold a line with dignity rather than force. The judge read the letter slowly, then again. Her expression changed, minutely but unmistakably. She looked up, first at Peterson, then at Officer Donnelly. Her question came evenly. Why, with no signs of hostility or disorder, was this man detained? Why had no effort been made to understand? His presence to assess his intent? Donnelly, for the first time, hesitated. He said he had felt something was off. He could not name what. He simply sensed something that didn't sit right. That was all. It sounded thin, too thin. In the quiet that followed, the courtroom itself seemed to draw judgment. No one spoke, but everyone understood the distance between instinct and reason had been exposed. The judge announced the ruling would be held until the following day. The final decision would come after one more night of silence, where the weight of what had been said and unsaid could settle fully into the room. On the 3rd day, the courtroom was full, not with cameras or national headlines, but with quiet figures who had heard enough to know they should be there. A handful of veterans sat scattered in the back rows, some in old uniforms, others in civilian clothes. Local residents filled the remaining seats, most of them silent, some curious. A few journalists lingered near the exits, notebooks open, uncertain if this was a story or a whisper. The weight in the room was not from spectacle, but from attention. The judge entered without ceremony. She moved through the final documents, with precision, her voice steady, without theatrical pause. The charges were dismissed in full. The written protocol filed by Officer Donnelly was declared invalid. The arrest was deemed unjustified. George Peterson, citizen and veteran, was not only cleared of all accusation, but was granted a formal apology by the city of Charlotte for his wrongful detainment. The words were brief, but they carried a clarity that settled over the room like a long exhale. There was no cheer, no eruption, only stillness. The decision was rare, almost unheard of. Yet it had been reached not through pressure or headlines, but through record and principle. In the judge's reasoning, respect was not a commodity that expired. It did not fade with time or vanish in age. It endured, even when overlooked. After the session ended, General Ellerby walked toward Peterson. No press gathered around them, no crowd formed. They met near the aisle, standing between the wooden benches and the courtroom wall. No words passed. Between them, only a handshake, firm, brief, and understood. Behind them, people watched without intrusion. Someone recorded the moment quietly from their phone. Others simply stood still, bearing witness to something seldom seen, the restoration of dignity without noise, without ceremony, anchored only in truth. Later that day, Officer Donnelly received a formal notice of internal review. He was placed on administrative leave pending evaluation. It was not a dismissal, not a public reprimand, but it marked a fracture, a shift. He was offered a place in a mandatory retraining program, the same leadership development course taught by General Ellerby. The decision of whether to accept was his alone, but the silence in the station hallways had already made clear that something had changed. A week after the verdict, George Peterson returned to Harmony Green. The morning was crisp. He moved with the same slow, deliberate steps and found his way back to the bench where everything had started. He sat quietly, holding a book in one hand. But he did not open it, not at first. His gaze lingered on the trees, now slightly taller than before, their leaves stirring gently in the breeze. They stood like quiet witnesses, grown from the same ground he had once helped clear. Beside the bench a small plaque had been installed. No announcement had been made, no ceremony held. It read, "This bench is dedicated to George Peterson, resident, veteran, citizen." He had not asked for it. He had never mentioned it. But the city, in its own quiet way, had decided that some silences must be acknowledged. He sat there for a long time, not in reflection, not in bitterness, simply present. Because sometimes what follows in justice is not thunder, it is peace, not victory, but restoration. And in the stillness of a city that had almost forgotten him, George Peterson returned, not as a headline, but as a name the wind remembered.